Don't do that to me.
So I've got about 45 minutes. That's
Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to get started. Thank you. It's fantastic to see so many people here today. My name is Arco Lucier. I'm the head of school of Geography, Planning and Spatial Sciences. Elaine used to be my boss for quite a few years. And it's an absolute pleasure to introduce her today. So I'll keep my introduction now brief, and we'll have a fantastic reception after Elaine's talk. I'll have a few more words then. But we're here for a very special seminar that doesn't conclude, Professor Elaine Stratford's remarkable 3 decades at the University of Tasmania. Elaine joined UTAS in 1996 and since held almost every role it is possible to hold in a school and a university. She was the first tenured female geographer here, the first female head of school, and the inaugural director of the Peter Underwood Centre for Educational Attainment. She has secured major research funding, published field-shaping books and papers, and led the International Journal of Geographical Research for almost a decade, helping to grow its global reach and influence. Her work has consistently asked how people can flourish in place, in movement and over life course, and how universities and other institutions can help make that possible. Now, before we begin, I want to convey apologies from several key people who would very much like to have been here. The Vice-Chancellor, Professor Rufus Black, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, Professor Natalie Brown, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, Coates, and our own Aidan Davison, who are all at Academic Council in Launceston. As Rufus wrote, he's a great admirer of Elaine's work, and he would have moved almost anything else in his diary to be there. So it's unfortunate timing. People like Jason Burns send us apologies from a conference. Andrew Harwood is teaching on Bruny Island, and I know that there were several others who would have loved to be here. But this is why we're also recording today's event. So today's seminar, Critical and Creative Reflections on three-decade career, or It's Not Over Till It's Over, Reframes, Retirement as Regeneration. Elaine will reflect on the ideas, collaborations, and institutional settings that have shaped her research, her teaching, and leadership. From work on place, justice, and care to her efforts to strengthen geography and education here at UTAS and internationally. She also turned her attention to the shifting landscape of higher education in Australia and how our discipline's core values, curiosity, empathy, commitment to the flourishing of people and places, can continue to matter in times of change. True to form, Elaine is not retiring. And I've tried to avoid that word. She's not retiring in any conventional sense. She'll continue as an honorary professor and is establishing Studio Stratford and has a queue of PhD students, books and projects still to come. We look forward to continuing our work together. But for now, though, we have the privilege of hearing her bring together the threads of an extraordinary career and open a conversation about what comes next for geography and for university. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elaine Stratford.
Thank you, Arco. And I actually do put my pants on one leg at a time. If I could get you to advance the slide for me, Arco. And I'm assuming that that's on. Well, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. Pay my respects to elders past and present, both here and in my birthplace of Saskatoon in Canada. Long histories of knowledge making, care, and custodianship predate this university by many thousands of years. And that continuity, I think, reminds us all that learning, responsibility, and renewal have deeper purposes and we should honor them. And you'll notice I'm reading because if I don't, I'm going to go off script and I won't sort of stay in the spirit of the title of the talk. It won't be over for hours. Well, look, thank you all so much for being present here today, both in person and online. And thanks to the more than 30 of you who sent apologies and best wishes. It means an inordinate amount to me to have us gathered here today as different communities, and it gives me an opportunity to pay tribute to all of you because I want you to know how much you've enriched my life. So, unlike the subtitle, I promise this talk will be over in less than an hour, but I do want to comment on the title because the distinction, at least for me, between retirement and regeneration is fundamental. In fact, Phil and I ban it from the house. For me, retirement suggests withdrawal and perhaps even diminishment, especially in a culture that still values paid work over much else. And I personally find that language unhelpful. So next slide, please. So by contrast, regeneration is about growth. It's about renewal rather than withdrawal. It's apt for ecology, for social systems, for our embodied selves as we move through space-time. And for me, it is a way to honor what has been and to make way for what has yet to come. So today I am going to reframe my official retirement as a renewal of purpose, and I'm committed to that. I'll say something about the changing landscape of higher education, the civic purpose of universities, integrity and imagination in universities. And I'm going to reflect on various bends in the roads that characterize my career over 30 years here and 10 years in other universities prior to coming. I'll trace some of the things that have shaped me. And I'm going to emphasize the point that if there is a thread running through the whole story, it is this: work worth doing is shared. So I'm going to trace my little mycelial network of a life. And it's going to be rather more intimate than perhaps I'm comfortable with and is common for a setting like this. But it also feels most honest for me to reflect on my life in that way. And I've been encouraging so many people to do autoethnography for so many years, it feels a bit like I should expose myself to that test as well. Next slide, please. So, questions about higher education in Australia have preoccupied me for much of my career. No surprise, because the social institution that is higher education shapes how those of us who work in universities work, and it affects what we can offer the world. Critiques of the neoliberal university are common. Its focus on rankings, on algorithms, on debt, academic freedom, pressures of massification, and moves from education as a public to a private investment. Those critiques matter, but they can be presented as if the critics were outside the system, which they seem to imagine as monolithic and intractable. That's not my experience of universities at all. My sense instead is that most of us are deeply entangled in the sector's complexities, and we contribute to those dynamics as much as we are shaped by them. So we need to ask ourselves how and why we are implicated. Over 40 years, I've seen several cycles of rollback and rollout neoliberalism, centralization and decentralization, funding cuts and injections, increasing and decreasing student numbers, visionary research initiatives, and policy missteps or innovations. I've worked with several senior leadership teams under 6 vice chancellors, 3 relatively closely. So here, for example, from 2016 to 2018, like Aidan, I served on University Council as the elected staff representative, first under Peter Rathjen and then Rufus Black. And Rufus asked me to stay on the council's Built Environment and Infrastructure Committee until 2020. And this, of course, was at a time when plans for the city and our relocation were seeding intense public debate. And since 2023, I've worked about 20% of my time in the academic division on transformation research with colleague Jason Byrne. So those various vantage points have, I think, given me a granular sense of how decisions are made, revised, and either implemented or derailed. They've led me to understand that university decision-making is a kind of institutional parkour, if you like, or skateboarding. We work to take great leaps in the hope that we are not going to faceplant. So I have never experienced those in universities, and especially in university executive positions, as uniformly malevolent. I haven't. Yes, I've seen short-sightedness, and I have seen misconduct. But I've also seen genuine and ethical commitment and incredible courage, not least from our current VC. There can be no doubt in my mind that university personnel are constrained by funding models, policy frameworks, and political cultures over which we have limited control, but it doesn't mean we don't have influence. And those realities complicate simplistic narratives that too often seek to blame others. And there are howling examples of it in the Mercury this week. In fact, those realities ask us to hold critique and empathy together. Can we be critical empathetically? I think we can. It is a difficult but necessary self-discipline in work to help restore trust in universities, one person, one day, one step at a time. Now, I don't think we can undo neoliberalism from within, and I'm not an apologist for the system. The pressures are real and complex. Our agency is crucial. Yes, it's constrained sometimes by our own limiting self-talk, by the dynamics of different teams, by structural settings, none of which, however, is beyond our influence. Sometimes, however, that agency gets lost under that mountain of email that we privilege because it seems the simplest thing to do in hard times. So since most of us only have our time, our energy, and our reputation as capital, how we spend that time really matters. And reactivity is not the answer, I think. So what then is possible, and how can possibility be enacted? Next slide. I'm channeling a bit of Jamie here. We used to have really long conversations about the hearth. I actually think that the most effective scales of agency involve individuals and hearth groups or small teams. Evidence suggests that together, a person and their communities can create cohesive engagement and support adaptive capacities and foster a strong sense of identity if we also avoid tribalism. Hearths are the unit where cultural groups flourish, where we can cultivate political literacies. They are where we can practice ethical leadership take time for caring work, learn from those we teach, and mentor them in turn, and be both civic and civil. And those labors manifest, I think, in thousands of daily actions, and they can include deep, compassionate care for self, for others, and for Earth. And those are the labors in which I'm interested. Those are the labors of constant renewal. So what might those observations mean? And this is a question Arco posed to me. What might those observations mean for the rising generations of scholars and professional staff with ambitions to contribute to the best that higher education is and can be? Well, first, I think those observations suggest that ambition divorced from care, justice, and integrity is corrosive. And there's an awful lot of pressure on people to be ambitious in ways that look like that. Ambition aligned with enduring values is energizing and nourishing. I have been ambitious throughout my career for ideas and the discipline, the university, the sector, and yes, I have also been ambitious for myself. And I am convinced that the next generation will need supportive, including senior and retiring or regenerating colleagues if they're to prioritize wisdom and serenity and a strong sense of service and collaboration for their careers. So in my view, our work should not require some kind of spiritual, psychological, or associated risk register. Let us take time to ask what matters, over what time scale, and for what outcomes. And let's not forget the intrinsic worth of the journey. I keep asking myself when I see particularly young scholars coming through, I just want to say, it's okay. There's no rush. Take your time. Take your time. Second, my observation means recognizing that the art and craft of academic life might just lie in answering this question: what is mine to carry? Hint, everything not nailed down is not the best answer. So for me, the art and craft of academic life is interwoven with the craft and art of personal life. So back to my mycelial network. I think life in total is a delicious invitation to live experimentally. And in the process, learning from failure provides wonderful opportunities to grow. And certainly when spiced with laughter and the occasional set of tears, failure has been one of my most reliable teachers, and I've done it often. Third, my observations underscore the point that success is collective and caring. Our work is relational, even when it looks solitary. I think effective work involves attending to our own needs to flourish in relation. Well, why? As a social institution, higher education will always take more than we can reasonably give. Always. And as organizational expressions of that social institution of higher education, universities cannot help but take and take and take. And I watch us all being run ragged. And that, I think, is a hallmark, actually, of organizational life per se. So we need to set the boundaries. We need to treat rest and health and relationships and joy as central parts of our scholarly and professional lives. These are not indulgences. They are forms of productive resistance and consistent individual and collective renewal. So my observations, I hope, invite us to keep alive a sense of wonder and of curiosity. I think we need to remember why we were drawn here, because we want to understand and engage with and in the world. Curiosity is the antidote to cynicism, which is a dead hand. And the ground from which renewal continually springs is also curiosity. And all of that leads to my own regenerative story, which I am bravely going to share with you now. Next slide, please. I live my life knowing that language speaks us into existence as much as we speak it. Like shards of glass, our lives can be cutting or they can be kaleidoscopic. In late 2014, when I was preparing for my second and thankfully successful promotion application to full prof, my mentor, David Rich, asked me to distill what I professed and do so in a single orienting question. It was one of the best things that's ever happened to me, having him ask that question. And after a full year of reflection, I realized that the question, the inquiry that had characterized decades of my work was this: in place, on the move, across the whole of the life course, how do we come to flourish? And of course, what does that mean? It also means, and why do we languish? And that question did not emerge from the ether. I was born in Saskatoon, Canada, in May 1963, the youngest of four in a house of mavericks. At a time when it was considered outrageous, our parents were vegetarian, teetotaler theosophists. On the bookshelves in our home, the Bible sat next to the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, works on the Buddha, and works by Marx and Annie Besant. Rock and roll was frowned upon in favor of classical music. Our clothes came from the cooperative, not the more fashionable Hudson's Bay Company. They were hippies in the 40s, and they were damn brave about it. Well, I felt really safe and held until about the age of 6, and then life got complicated because I went to school and found myself on the outer. My parents were exhausted, teaching full-time at university, studying part-time for master's degrees, caring for a family. My brother William started to struggle with lifelong challenges. And then when I was 9, pardon me, I was told that my father, sister Nicola, and I were moving to New Zealand. Fancy that. My mother would join us 9 months later. Being 11 and 14 years older than I was, my sister Caroline and brother were, heading for adulthood. They stayed in the north. The family was never again together in the same place at the same time. And I have to say, those early experiences of security and rupture shaped but did not determine me. They made me attentive to how people identify with place, how they are dislocated, and how they move through the world in large and in small ways and flourish or languish. Fancy that. Nice post hoc rationalization there. So my early migrations to Canada in 1972, and then from New Zealand to Australia at the end of 1975, taught me that place and movement influence who we are and what we can imagine. And they gave me a complex relationship with care, but also with anger. I was pretty mad about all of these moves. They gave me a complex relationship with rebellion, but also with people pleasing, because I was constantly trying to find out who I was, where I was. And they gave me a longing for peace in the face of flux. Next slide, please. So by 1975, I felt reasonably settled in New Zealand. And then I was told we were moving to Adelaide. So my mother could establish the country's first undergraduate program in speech pathology. And I was sent to join her ahead of my father and sister Nick. Over time, Adelaide became home, as places do when one holds still long enough. And I was there for 20 years. It was my second migration before adolescence, and it sharpened my sense of place and of dislocation. At Blackwood High, I did excel academically, and I loved it. I only took my first geography class in year 11, but I found it gave me a language for what I'd been intuiting and what I belabored here, the things about space and place, about movement, about dislocation, about care. Like many of us, I worked casual jobs after school, and I saved enough money to travel back to Canada at the end of grade 12 in 1980, trying to decide if I belonged there. Well, I returned here to Adelaide in 81, early, and I enrolled in the University of Adelaide, where I was a complete fish out of water. So I dropped out. I volunteered in a hospital and a shelter for young mothers. I waitressed and I cleaned. And in 1982, I enrolled at Flinders University, which was just recovering from a Maoist occupation of the registry. And I did a double degree in geography and visual art history and theory. That pairing has informed my work ever since. And it taught me that the analytical and the imaginative are wonderful companions. During my undergraduate years, I was also reasonably heavily involved in student politics. And with someone who became a dear friend, Diane Joy, I ran the Women's Studies campaign protesting Flinders' closure of that program. I remain really proud that we won, and Women's Studies moved from being a one-unit offering to a full degree and a postgraduate program. We took great delight in organizing with the Women's Studies program at the University of Kent in Canterbury to picket Flinders University Vice Chancellor when he visited there one month. In 1986, I completed honors on how congenitally and adventitiously blind people perceive the environment. Because of course, perceptions of place are not just about vision, and yet geography is so centered on the visual. I was fortunate enough to receive a first and a medal, university medal, and that set me up for the PhD. I also married that year, and suffice to say, it was a precipitous and short-lived experiment. And I continued to live my life experimentally and to learn from different kinds of failure. A tutorship, what we would now call an associate lectureship, was advertised at Flinders in 87, and I secured it at the age of 22, goodness knows how, and I started a part-time PhD. I can't remember the topic now. But after my marriage ended in 1989, a dear friend, Jane Kelly, who was also recovering from separation, moved in. And that was very distracting because I then spent the next 6 months sleeping about 3 hours a night, partying heavily and pretending to be a professional during the day. It was great fun, not something I'd necessarily repeat. And by early the next year, 1990, I knew I needed to do something different. So I resigned and I quit my PhD. I'm a 2-time dropout. And I traveled to Europe with Jane for 6 months. And then I went back to Canada for another 6. And I was still trying to decide where do I belong? My parents were British. Do I belong there? I always feel at home when I go back to the UK. Do I belong in Canada? Do I belong in Australia? Sure. So I came back. And that year taught me that uncertainty can be a form of momentum, which is great. But I don't necessarily recommend disorientation as a geographer's best friend, but it was certainly educative. So all up, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, my 20s were complicated. And if there was a 6-digit Australian government research code for life experiments in progress, it'd be mine. And this is a really crucial moment. This one's really crucial. Just before I left to go to Europe, Di Joy from the Women's Studies campaign, by then the activities officer at Flinders University, she'd hired a new assistant. His name was Phil Hutch. And at my farewell party, just days before I left for Europe, he kept handing me glasses of champagne with this charming smile he has, and jokingly asked me not to go. And I equally jokingly said to him, I'll see you in 6 months. Well, it turned out to be a year before I saw him again. And his opening line was this: "You're late." And we've been together ever since. In 1992, with Phil's full support, and I want to say here, you couldn't meet a more supportive person anywhere on the planet. So I started a new PhD at the Mawson Centre for Environmental Studies at the University of Adelaide, and it was a wonderful time, consolidating lifelong friendships with people like Nikki Mazer and Beverly Clark, who's now the professor of geography at Flinders University. And I was also able to tutor in the master's program and work as a research assistant for the professor of linguistics, who gave me my love of green speech. And his name was Peter Mulhauser, spoke 12 languages, brain like a TARDIS, amazing human being. Well, Phil and I were a bit fertile. We didn't realize that at the time. So our first son, Lewis, was born in late 1992 because I got pregnant just after I started the PhD. So I had 3 months paid maternity leave. Phil then cared for Lewis and finished his own degree in anthropology. Then I submitted my PhD in 1995. It was examined by the planner Leonie Sandercock and the geographer Ruth Fincher. And I was deeply gratified that it was awarded without amendment. Although I have to say, it took 25 years to get the book out, and it gave me great delight to send it to both of them with a small letter of apology for being a bit tardy. And then in 1996, I was invited to take a 1-year position at the Australian Defence Force in Canberra, filling in for a colleague in the geography department. By then, my parents' health was starting to deteriorate. And when my mother came to visit halfway through the year, I knew something was wrong. And she returned to Adelaide, and it became apparent that cancer that she'd had several years before had come back and metastasized. So late in the year, Phil and I took Lewis and headed across the Hay Plain with Mike in utero. And I had to say goodbye to her, knowing that I might not see her again. And indeed, that proved to be the case. But while I was in Canberra, this job came up. And I applied for it. And I was flown to Hobart for an interview, offered the position, and we moved in the December 1996. And that move was a hinge between life before and life since. And it's interesting, I don't know how many of you were blow-ins, but we came with the idea of maybe 3 to 5 years here, and that was 30 years ago. Kind of gets in your blood here, doesn't it? So next slide, please. So late 96, I think Hobart was a different city with a different university, smaller, homogeneous and constrained. And I'm deeply gratified that people like Anna Pafitas Robb Valentine and Prue Bonham are here because people like they influenced my thinking as a planner and geographer. And they've all shown, I think, immense courage in their own public life, making really tough decisions that have enriched our city. And that's why I asked them, among other reasons. They're just nice folks. It was also the stage for an intense convergence of life events for me. And my memories of the time from arrival to 1999, I have to say, are pretty fragmentary. When we arrived, I was 7 months pregnant. Lewis was just 4. Mike was born in January, mid-January, 97. I had 6 weeks maternity leave. My mother died 2 weeks after Mike was born. My dad would die a year later, but he'd had his first stroke. We bought and moved into a house a month after, and I was holding on with white knuckles. Fortunately, we moved in to a house, and there was a pair of banana and pajamas about the size of Lewis's on the fence next door. And the woman who's had washed the pajamas earlier that morning, Siobhan, turned out to be a gift of friendship and support at a time I needed it most, and has been like that ever since. But Phil and I are both a bit introverted. Our children were in childcare and school, but our reserves were really thin by this stage, and it was a very dislocating time to enter a tightly networked town. So this school became my anchor. Might have even become a bit of a comfort blanket, if I'm telling the truth. And thankfully, under Jamie's leadership, it was incredibly child-friendly. And HDR candidates such as Stuart Williams and Julie Davidson would often appear to sit with Mike when I had to teach, since Mike spent the first few months under my desk when he wasn't nursing. By 1999, things had settled enough for me to lift my head and look around. And together with Julie, who was by then graduated, I founded the Sustainable Communities Research Group, and we won recognition from the Dean as an emerging research group. And we attracted a really talented cohort of research candidates, most of whom I continue to work with or associate with now. Denby Armstrong, Philippa Watson, Carol Farbotko, Rebecca Jackson, Andrew Harwood, and others. And I began to connect our work to local, state, and federal agencies in ways that I hope seeded collaborations that have shaped decades that followed. So through all of that, my interest in place studies began to deepen because I was finally kind of putting down roots. And at the time, my long-term commitment to island and archipelagic studies took shape. Peter Hay's influence, of course, but I've been really blessed to work with people such as Godfrey Baldacchino, the Canada Research Chair in Island Studies, who's also in Malta, and Elizabeth McMahon, who was here but is now at UNSW. So looking back, 1997 to 2005 were years of consolidation and quiet ambition and existential angst that I think typifies but is not really helpful to scholarly life. So I did what we do. I was driven, naive, and far less emotionally and politically intelligent than I would have liked to have been. But the foundations were laid, and I wasn't yet aware what the architecture would look like, but it took a left-hand turn and it ended up in leadership. So in mid-2005, Jamie went on sabbatical, and I'd been deputy head for only a short time. I was a senior lecturer at the time, and I agreed to act in his stead. And when he returned, he said, "I don't want it anymore, it's all yours." And the dean sanctioned that. And I served in that role from 2006 to the end of 2013, a span of years that invited judgment, stamina, and a willingness to learn both fast and deep. Might know how that feels. So leadership was exhausting and it was exhilarating. And if it weren't for people like Trish McKay, Pauline Harraby, Darren Turner, and others in the school, a great professional services team wouldn't have made it. During the period, most of which was under, I think, a very good VC overall, although it kind of had an interesting ending. VC Daryl LeGroux was my VC for a lot of that time. And in that period, I completed a master's in tertiary education management, which at the University of Melbourne, which was great. That was sponsored by David Rich. I led the university's community, place, and change research theme area. And that sadly languished when the federal government decided it wasn't going to give third sector funding, or what was called community engagement funding, to universities, which I still think was a mistake. I participated in the Women in Leadership program led by the wonderful Jill Curry. I served on numerous boards and committees and so on, including chairing the Milo Implementation Committee. Milo Implementation Committee had $7 million, except for the $800,000 that the chief operating officer took out at the end, which was for staff development on how to use Milo. Fought that one and lost it, I'm afraid. Continued to secure grants, teach, and supervise. Marco's mentioned that I was the first woman to do a few things in this school. And I have to say, one of the things you learn in a situation like that is how authority attaches to some bodies more than it attaches to others. So I learned to navigate the expectations placed on women leaders. And you kind of have to think of Goldilocks in a room full of organizational bears. Be too soft, don't be too hard, and try not to get swallowed up. And that was my experience of faculty executive meetings for nearly a decade. VC Peter Rathjen arrived in 2011, a gale force wind, among other things. He presided over a faculty's restructuring. And so in 2013, after years of careful work with the team to build our school, I was instructed to close it and merge it with agriculture. And doing so remains one of the hardest things I've ever done. I went back to the rank and file at the start of 2014, knowing that geographers such as I, as it turns out, are not actually very good at closing our own maps and ending certain journeys. And then in 2015, out of the blue, I was in Canberra doing a leadership program, teaching a leadership program for the University of Melbourne's L.H. Martin Institute. And I'd been doing that since 2012. We continued to do it until 2017. Anyway, I get this phone call out of the blue from David Sadler, then Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, asking me if I would be the interim director of a new entity called the Peter Underwood Centre for Educational Attainment. And of course, I knew of Peter. I knew Peter not well, Peter Underwood, because A, Phil was working at Government House, and B, I ran the Governor's Environmental Management Scholarships. Anyway, Peter Underwood Centre, lovely, beautiful partnership across University of Tasmania, the state government, and the Office of the Governor. And its focus was and remains to improve the educational and life chances of children and young people in this state. And I'm really gratified that Becky and Helen are here today. I know Ollie was unable to come, but they were among the core team, along with Kitty Tarila, who made this all happen. The Underwood Centre years were exhilarating and excoriating in equal measure. We built it from scratch. We built it from the first paperclip. And staff, programs, governance structures, relationships with government, community, loved it. It demanded a grasp, in my view, of how geography and education, policy, and family life intersect. And in setting it up with others, my commitments to place and to justice and care were given concrete expression. And I loved the challenge. But the politics were grueling. And despite my best efforts, near April 2017, in a brief meeting with no witnesses afforded to me, David informed me he was letting me go. Well, I haven't mentioned this much, and I wasn't sure whether I would today or not, but the public narrative that was to be provided for us all to save face was that I had successfully established the center and was returning to my heartland research career. It was framed as completion, but it felt like a rupture. Still not certain exactly what happened, but it absolutely rocked my world, and I could not face returning to my home school. And I have to say, there's a person in this room who saved my life the day that happened, and her name is Jandy Godfrey. Thank you. Gave me some of the best professional advice I've ever had that day. So I spent from April 2017 to the end of 2019 in the study for the Institute of Social Change, licking my wounds, doing research, including with the Underwood Center. And I really value Richard Eccleston for affording me the space to do that recalibration. By the time the ISC morphed into the Tasmanian Policy Institute at the end of 2019, I'd been asked by the Dean of Science to be acting head of a relatively new school. Some of you may have heard of it. It was called the School of Technology, Environments and Design, which combined geography, spatial sciences, environmental studies, ICT, and architecture and design. I thought it was a really neat configuration, actually. It had around 110 staff across the campuses. And so on the 1st of January 2020, I took up the role. 6 weeks later, Rufus decided it would be disestablished to make the disciplines more visible. And I, as a geographer, I get that. Geography disappears in other disciplines. So part of me was going, yes, yes. Part of me was going, really? Really? So in the first year of the pandemic, I led another school dissolution. And in 2021, I supported the 3 new heads of school, including my own, of the successor schools, the 3 that came out of that. And I returned to the rank and file and an ARC grant that I loved. So for me, leadership has been a story of building, and it's been a story of stewarding and of letting go. It's kind of a bit like my personal life, really, huh? And it's been in this amazingly turbulent setting that is the university system. It's been about holding fast to my values in contexts where values are not always welcome. It's been about making mistakes and learning from them. And it's about the privilege of witnessing your courage and creativity and resilience up close. So it's also taught me that the deepest work of leadership is rarely visible, but it's always accumulative. Next slide, please. So just a couple more slides. I want to change direction on my mycelial pathway. There are 3 constant and valued companions throughout my career: research, writing, and editing. And they've been shaped by leftist and feminist post-structural thinkers. I've taken from them tools of critique, commitments to care, and an attentiveness to power. And I've tried really hard to question orthodoxies that shut inquiry down. So all of the intellectual threads that I've been talking about have most recently converged in a focus on element geographies. And I love this painting. It's by oh damn, I can't remember his name. I keep misplacing it. I think it's William McFarlane, Scottish, and it's called The Elements. So I'm now focusing a lot of my work on elemental geographies, earth, air, fire, water, and how they're entangled with diverse forms of oppression, but also care. My most recent book, The Drowned, was released last month, and it exemplifies that work. It asks some really difficult questions about whose drowning deaths are remembered and forgotten, and about how drowning is used as an instrument of violence and control. Early critical reception of the book has produced an invitation from Palgrave to lead a new 10-year book series. 10 years, a 10-year book series on elemental thinking with the publisher Palgrave, which will nicely take me into my 70s. And I hope my own next contribution to that will be a project called Burned, cheery subjects, I know, and about questions about how fire has been used to harm and discipline and exploit. For example, burning people at the stake, putting little boys up chimneys, taking matches to atomic bombs and blowing up deserts, things like that, that kind of stuff. And in parallel, I've continued to work on life course geographies, which draw together my longstanding interests in journeys. Some of those life course stories have involved home, and I've just recently also last month published the Routledge Handbook on Home with a delightful co-editor, Katie Walsh. Never met her, lives in Sussex. We had a great time working together for 3 years. It's lovely. And some of those life course studies will appear in my next sole authored book, which is due in June, with Edward Elgar, and that's centered on rethinking life course methodologies. And it was the focus of a trip that I took in February to Bellagio as a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow, which was wonderful. Over that whole time, I have been incredibly privileged. I've supervised 80 honors masters and PhD candidates, and I have learned more from them than I'm sure I have ever taught. I remain perennially grateful for the trust they vest in me. It's an immense privilege. I've also served as treasurer of the Institute of Australian Geographer, although I have to say Pauline did most of the hard work because I have dyscalculia. I can't keep numbers in my head to save my life. But I also had the privilege of being the editor-in-chief of Geographical Research for 10 years. And in passing, anyone who has an interest in editing, pay heed to this. It is a wonderful and quietly influential role in academia. You sit at the confluence of leading edge ideas and debates. You learn how to steward professional peer development and support particularly early career academics coming through, especially if you treat the editorial position as developmental, not punitive. And it can be transformative. I've loved it. And finally, underpinning my favorite things has been a long-term commitment that has enabled the rest of my life to be what it has been. And that is this. For what is now a full quarter of a century, and probably Denby Armstrong's fault, I have made substantial time each week for health and well-being, for lifting heavy weights, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. My passion for those practices is so clear that I'm nearly finished a certificate 4 in life coaching, specializing in health and well-being coaching, career, and life course coaching that involves coaching around birth and life transitions and death. Seems fairly apt for what I've been doing for the last 30 years. Next slide, please. So a few things have shaped my next steps. First, Jamie and Julie both died last October, and as many of you know, their passing was a sobering reminder of finitude and of the courage with which people face it, and the quiet legacies they leave, and we take forward. Second, and perhaps because of that, I kept thinking about my own inevitable elderhood. And it reinforced the idea that if I'm fortunate enough to live another 3 to 5 decades, and I am training every day to do that, those 3 decades, those 5 decades, they're really precious. My beloved Phil is a mere 12 years older than me. And we've started planning for adventures and a more expansive rhythm of life as a couple. We're about to finish our 2nd book together. And we have our kids and friends and family, and more friends to make. And third, and at that time, ARCO gave me my teaching allocation for 2025. It was a perfectly reasonable teaching allocation. If I had been head of school, I would have given me that teaching allocation. But in an instant, I mean, literally, I read the email and in an instant I went, I can't do this anymore. Despite enjoying online teaching, I love classroom teaching, I love field teaching. This new form of hybrid teaching sucks. Some students are physically present, some are attending. I had a student in a master's program on his phone, in a kitchen, earning money, listening to me. This is not a good way. Sorry. Maybe call me old-fashioned, not a good way to be learning. So I knew in my bones it was time to go. And because academics are industrially constrained to a 40-40-20 workload model, when I realized I could not do what had reasonably been asked of me, the question I had to put to my head of school was, so it's not a matter of if I leave, but when and how. And in my usual fashion, I offered him 3 solutions. Never go to the boss with a problem without a solution. And I had told him which one I would prefer he picked. And he did. Thank you. Much obliged. And so it gave the school a year to plan for my departure. It gave me a year to transition with dignity, except in the quiet moments of the middle of the night when I rocked in a fetal position with my thumb in my mouth, wondering what I was going to do next. So for most of this year, I have officially been on leave 3 days a week, working 1 day a week for the school and 1 day a week for the academic division, and 6 days a week on the things I love. From August, I moved part-time. And on the 31st of December, I will step out of my job and into my vocation more fully. I am not leaving. This is false advertising. I've just signed a casual contract starting the 1st of January. I am available for hire, but I will also be doing my supervision, my research, and my grant writing as an honorary associate. Either way, in the time that has been given to me this year, and thank you, ARCO, I've taken great delight in discovering something. I may be thoroughly of the institution. My parents were academics. I think it's in my genes. I may be of the institution, but I'm not institutionalized. And I have to tell you, that was a really fantastic relief. It was a real surprise. So I've established Studio Stratford as a sole trader venture focused on research, writing, editing, and coaching. And I have to tell you, I'm open for business right now. I have my first 4 clients. And if you're interested in learning more, you know where to find me. Last slide, please. No, it's not right, the last slide, but the last slide's real short. So let me close. I want to reflect on geography's enduring values. I think at best, this discipline invites us to be curious about the world, to attend to scale, connection, and friendships, be in conversation, care about power, confront it, leverage it. commit ourselves to people and place. And I have to say, my official departure is based on the faith that people will take forward the kinds of things that I've learned, not because it's me that's learned them, but because they are enduring lessons that are important for us all. So it's not over till it's over. And you'll see me looking around town. You'll see me looking suspiciously relaxed. But just remember, I'm actually doing field work of the very best kind.
So Nicola.
And thank you so much, everyone, for what you've given me over decades. Go well, be safe.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine. What a wonderful delivery. We have to get out of here. I'm sorry, we don't have time for questions, but please join us for the reception at the Uni Club in a few minutes. Thank you so much, and thanks people for online for joining as well.
Yes.